2 days. That's how long it took after Trump's tariffs on Canada took effect for Hydro-Québec to quietly stop sending meaningful electricity into New England. Not 2 months, not 2 weeks, 2 days. The company says it was about low prices, not politics. The timing says something else entirely, and it left the region that keeps the lights on for 6 American states leaning harder on natural gas and oil plants, right as demand started climbing into summer. Utility planners don't make decisions about which power sources to lean on inside 2 days under normal circumstances. A shift this abrupt, landing precisely inside the same 48-hour window a major trade policy took effect, is exactly the kind of coincidence that either really is coincidence or isn't one at all. New York imported more electricity from Canada last year than any other American state. New England, at points in a normal year, gets up to 10% of its power from a 932-mile transmission line that starts at James Bay, Quebec, and ends in suburban Boston. Built specifically in the 1980s, so this exact region would never have to depend entirely on its own gas plants again. 4 provinces, Quebec, Ontario, British Columbia, and Manitoba, together account for 86% of all Canadian electricity exports. Total electricity exports from Canada to the United States were worth $2.6 billion in a recent year, climbing as high as $5.8 billion when energy prices spiked. Let's trace the timeline precisely because the precision is exactly the point. On March 6th, right at the start of the still simmering trade war, Hydro-Québec quietly stopped exporting any meaningful amount of power to New England. The company's main transmission line into the region, known as the Phase 2 line, stopped exporting meaningful power 2 days after Trump's tariff on Canadian imports went into effect. Hydro-Québec's own explanation was that low prices on the region's spot electricity market drove the decision. Spring and early summer is a period when hydroelectric reservoirs are often relatively full from spring runoff, sometimes pushing spot prices down across the entire region for reasons that have nothing to do with politics at all. But here's why that explanation, even if completely true, still matters enormously. Dan Dolan, president of the New England Power Generators Association, put it bluntly. The grid operator's own planning process still assumes Quebec will be willing and able to send 2,000 megawatts into New England during moments of exceptionally high demand. That's roughly enough capacity to power close to 2 million American homes simultaneously during extreme heat waves or deep winter cold snaps, exactly when a regional grid is most likely to strain against its own limits. Building an entire regional reliability plan around the assumption that a foreign utility will reliably deliver that much power during a crisis, the exact scenario that collapsed within 48 hours of an unrelated political trigger, is precisely the kind of structural vulnerability Dolan was pointing directly at. The practical fallout was immediate and dirtier. The longer New England needed to replace the absent hydropower, the more often it had to call on natural gas or oil power plants to fill the gap, generating electricity that's both more expensive and considerably more polluting than the clean hydropower it was standing in for. Every megawatt hour New England had to source from gas instead of Quebec, hydro during this window represented a direct, measurable cost increase passed eventually to households and businesses paying the region's electricity bills, on top of the additional carbon emissions from burning fuel that a river's flowing water simply doesn't produce. Phelps Turner, director of the Clean Grid program at the Conservation Law Foundation, drew the conclusion plainly. This shows the potential for the region to be vulnerable to manipulations of the supply, whether or not this specific instance was one. Turner's word choice, manipulations rather than disruptions, is worth sitting with because it names the actual strategic risk underneath this entire episode more precisely than almost anything else. A single utility's decision to pause exports for commercial reasons is a normal business choice. The same decision made by a state-influenced utility in a country locked in an escalating trade dispute with its biggest customer carries a second, entirely different possible meaning underneath the first one. Hydro-Québec is not a purely private company. It's a crown corporation wholly owned by the government of Quebec, meaning its ultimate accountability runs through the same provincial government that's had every reason throughout this trade war to want leverage over Washington and every incentive to keep that leverage quietly deniable rather than openly weaponized. Serge Auberger, Chief Operating Officer for Hydro-Québec Energy Services in the United States, said the power company remained committed to its American contracts. That specific reassurance sits in an interesting tension with the pause this episode has already documented in detail. What complicates this entire story even further is something beyond politics. Quebec's own energy reserves are at their lowest levels in decades. The utility has been managing reduced water levels from several years of below-average precipitation across the province's northern watershed. Energy stocks have been declining year after year, driven by weather patterns entirely outside anyone's political control. Opposition politicians in Quebec's own provincial legislature have started asking publicly whether exporting power to New York makes sense at all during a stretch when the province's own domestic demand keeps climbing, while its reservoirs keep shrinking from the same drought conditions squeezing the export decision in the first place. So Hydro-Quebec's export strategy isn't purely a function of American demand or trade politics. It's being shaped simultaneously by a real internal debate inside Quebec itself over whether a province facing its own tightening electricity supply should be selling any meaningful volume south at all. Here's the honest complication. Electricity doesn't behave like most other commodities this channel has traced. Electrons don't stop at the local customs office to be inspected. Unlike a shipping container of aluminum or a truckload of lumber, electricity moving across a power line can't sit in a warehouse waiting for a tariff dispute to resolve itself. It has to be generated, transmitted, and consumed essentially simultaneously. That physical reality has forced trade lawyers on both sides of this border to confront a truly novel legal question. How do you even calculate a tariff's value on a product that exists for a fraction of a second before it's already been used? Every other tariff this channel has traced on steel, on lumber, on copper, ultimately comes down to a customs official examining a physical shipment. Electricity has no equivalent moment, which is why even amid the broadest tariff escalation in this trade war's history, nobody in Washington has actually attempted to formally tax it. Grid operators in both New England and New York said they didn't actually believe electricity would face a formal tariff at all. But out of an abundance of caution, they asked the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission for permission to collect trade levies just in case. Organizations whose entire job is managing electrical reliability for tens of millions of people don't typically ask a federal regulator for permission to do something they consider purely hypothetical. That request suggests they took the possibility seriously. The low water levels explanation also has real physical backing independent of any trade dispute. Quebec's hydroelectric system depends entirely on precipitation filling its reservoirs. Multiple consecutive years of below-average rain and snowfall represent a real measurable constraint that would pressure export volumes regardless of what was happening in Washington. An energy management expert at HEC Montreal backed the company's own explanation directly at the time, saying there was nothing political about Hydro-Quebec's export data, at least not yet, and that nothing had officially changed in the utility's actual policies despite the questions the tariffs raised. So step back and look at what this actually reveals, because it's a fundamentally different kind of story than almost anything else this channel has covered. Nobody signed a tariff on electricity. Nobody could. Not really. Electrons actually respect borders in ways that paperwork never will. And yet, 6 American states discovered within 48 hours of a completely unrelated trade action that the assumption their own grid planners had built, decades of infrastructure around, reliable, steady Canadian power whenever it's needed most, wasn't quite as guaranteed as anyone had treated it. Whether that was coincidence, caution, or quiet leverage, the practical result was identical either way. Dirtier, more expensive power flowing through New England's grid at the exact moment the region needed clean, cheap electricity the most. Somewhere in a home outside Boston or Albany this summer, an air conditioner is running on electricity that 2 days after a tariff took effect suddenly had to come from a gas plant instead of a Quebec dam. Nobody voted on that. Nobody signed a proclamation making it happen. A river 1,000 miles north simply kept flowing the same way it always had. And for reasons a company says were purely commercial, or perhaps for reasons far more complicated than that, the wire carrying that river's power south went quiet for months, right when the timing looked the least like a coincidence. This channel has documented a president willing to sign tariffs on wigs and hockey sticks, and a Canadian utility that never had to sign anything, announce anything, or admit anything to make an entire region feel within 48 hours exactly how exposed its own power grid actually was. 2 years into this trade war, that might be the most important lesson of all. Sometimes the most powerful weapons don't make headlines. They just quietly make a region feel exactly how much it depends on a neighbor that stopped answering the phone. I'm James Wren. This is The Decision Room. If this story made you see the trade war a little differently tonight, then I did my job. I'll see you when the next one happens.